Welcome to this week's Pandemic Podcast for Educators. My name is Gawain.
I'm Karam, Bales.
And I'm Merike.
Today we're going to be talking about pay during the pandemic. It's that time of year again where teachers' pay recommendations have been published and schools are looking at implementing them. And where a number of other things related to pay happened. So the first bit that we wanted to go into was we've now got the teachers' pay recommendations shared. But of course, it's very different from the way it used to be. It used to be really clear that there were different points on the pay scale, that those applied in all schools. And now, of course, we've got academies, which are different. We've got schools are no longer obliged to implement the pay offer put out by government. And also we've got basically the removal of the points. We've only got a minimum and a maximum. So in a sense, there's a sort of wild west of pay being created. Is that right? Fair way to describe it?
Yeah, isn't it also slightly different in Wales?
There are different arrangements in Wales as well. So pay's basically, there's lots of complexity to it. And yet, of course, what we're doing as educators is trying to put forward a unified position of what's fair everywhere. So the first thing we've got is the cost of living increase. And that's now come from, let's see if I can share now on the screen. You can hopefully see that. Here we've got from the National Education Union website, we've got the pay scales, which take into account the cost of living increase. So you can find this website quite easily. It's just neu.org.uk/pay-scales. And there you've got, we are now publishing, because the government no longer does it, only says minimum and maximum, but we're publishing the pay points on M1 right the way through to M6. That's the main scale, and the upper pay spine for England, and then the inner London, outer London, and London fringe waiting areas. So they're all there, and it's a variety of increases, isn't it, based on 2.75, but with some greater increases at the bottom of the pay scale there.
It's 5.5%, isn't it, for the very bottom?
So at the very bottom, those teachers starting on M1, beginning of their careers, goes up by 5.5%, then just under 5% for the following year, M2, etc. So these are the cost of living increases, aren't they? They're not to do with progressing up the pay scale or anything. These are just your increases based on what kind of factors contribute to that cost of living.
Sorry, I didn't hear you then. Sorry, Gawain.
I was just saying this is a cost of living increase, isn't it? So it's based on what kind of factors the cost of living increase. What are the increases for?
It's going to be on your rates of inflation, isn't it? So they're going to be looking at things like RPI, CPI, which then take into account your standard costs of like housing and food and utilities as well, isn't it? It all gets they do the calculations in the STRB.
Yeah, so this is where the independent pay review body makes recommendations to government, which it can accept or not. And basically, your cost of living increases just to make sure that you're not effectively having a pay cut, to make sure your pay is worth the same as it was in previous years. So that's the cost of living increase there. But in fact, is it adequate? Does it keep pace with inflation? Now, that's got to be one of the key questions, hasn't it?
Well, given that we had a pay freeze for so many years, I don't see that it would. So the NEU's got a pay calculator on its website, which I used earlier. Let's see if we can do this screen share wizardry technical stuff. Hang on.
What?
No, I can't, because apparently you won't let me.
Am I not letting you? All right, I'll let you share the screen. While I'm doing that, do you want to tell us what does that take? What information do you have to put into this pay calculator?
In the pay calculator, which area of the country you work in, and it's not that fussy. It either wants to know if you work in London, if you work on the outskirts of London, if you work in Wales, or if you work in the rest of the UK. So being in the northeast of England, I'm in the rest of the UK. Then it wants to know your pay scale. So for me, that's M6. And then I think that was all it asked for, actually.
Brilliant. Okay, and what did you find when you used the pay calculator? What does it tell you?
it made me a bit sad. Had rates of inflation and things gone up, I would be better off now. Can I do the screen sharing thing now? Yes, I can. Hang on. Let's do that, and then go to that. There we go. Can you see that?
Oh gosh. So
Yeah.
your salary should have increased by this amount, but the crucial bit, even with the latest pay increase, you're worse off by £357 a month.
Yeah.
£4,281 a year. Gosh, that really is significant, isn't it?
Isn't it just? So it's quite astonishing. I came across this calculator a couple of weeks ago whilst having brunch with my friend Tom. Hi, Tom. And Tom was also worse off, different pay scale, but worse off. And a couple of people that I know as well from around the region have tried it. Everybody has come out as worse off. So even being, as nice as it is to get a cost of living increase, had we not have had the pay freeze and had it have actually gone up in line with inflation, we would be much better off at the moment. I know of teachers over the past 10 years who've had to take second jobs, which sounds a little bit like a plot from Breaking Bad. I'm assured that they haven't been doing anything illegal.
Hopefully not.
Hopefully not, I'm sure not. Working in pubs and stuff on a night to try and make ends meet, which then obviously isn't ideal because teaching's tiring anyway, and then you're even more tired because you've been having to work extra jobs.
Right.
On a night.
And these are the decisions taken nationally by government. So basically, since we lost our collective bargaining rights, back in 1987, I think, there's that independent review body, and the government decides whether or not to accept its outcomes. So, but that's a position for teachers. Karam, the position for support staff, even worse, unfortunately. Yeah.
Support staff have a lot more issues with their pay. The last year's round of negotiations, the government came back with an offer of 2.75. I would assume that they did that to bring it in line with the average wage in the teacher pay spines. It went out to consultation.
Sorry to interrupt you there. That's of course the average increase in the teacher pay spines. But of course, that's on a much lower base, isn't it? Support staff are paid much, much lower. And of course, many of them not paid term time only. So essentially, they're not given any of that holiday pay or anything that teachers have.
As someone who personally works on a term time only contract, it is noticeable the loss in earnings from term time only. It went out to consultation, and on the 17th of August, Unite brought back the result of their consultation with members. The members voted to reject it. However, the Unite General Secretary has acknowledged that there will be a de facto imposition of the 2.75. So they are not planning on heading towards balloting. They don't think they're going to be able to get any more out of the government. And so it's just waiting for confirmation, and then that will go out to schools to be implemented.
Right. So again, it will be 2.75 across the board. So worse for support staff than teachers, and from a worse starting point as well. So you said then it goes out to implementation. Now this is an absolutely key bit, isn't it? Because there's a change now in what happens. In the past, the government determined levels of pay, admittedly not through a fair collective bargaining process with the unions, but through their independent review body, they determine pay levels. But that's no longer the case, is it? What happens now when the government says the increase should be 2.75? What's the next step?
It comes down to the choices now. The leaders of schools have this choice, and we are still chasing up last year's cost of living pay increase in some academies, aren't we? Which is a major concern. So it's a voluntary. It's not compulsory. Schools can choose, particularly at the moment with the additional costs of COVID being implemented in schools. We're going to have to be really observant for those schools that decide to use a cost of COVID as an excuse not to implement the pay increase.
So so these pay increases, these are the headlines that everyone will see coming out from government, but actually it's then dependent on your individual employer implementing that pay increase. And these are,
If
we're
you're
looking at
lucky enough
schools.
to have an employer who can implement that pay increase, because if you're in a position such as a supply teacher working for an agency, you're lucky if you get paid to scale.
Yeah, okay, so that's
Oh.
a further case. You've got the issue of supply teachers who often aren't paid on scale. How does that work, Merike? Have you experienced that?
Yeah, I spent quite a lot of my career so far on supply. So thinking back now, when back in the day when I was an NQT, when I worked through the local authority doing day-to-day supply, I think I got about 120 quid a day. During the same academic year, working for a supply agency, quite a large supply agency within the Northeast, I got £95 a day before tax. Yeah.
Wow. So, I mean, that's quite a significant deduction. And is that
It's a huge
because
deduction.
is that because they charge less to the schools, or is that just the cut that the agency
That's
takes
just
out?
the cut that they take, because I also happened to see an invoice on the desk in the business manager's office one day for me, and they were charging the school 140 something pounds a day. So
we're talking agencies that are coming in, they're charging schools more in order to supply teachers, but they're paying
yeah.
the teachers less, not what they're entitled to on the supply. So there are,
Yeah.
and we know there are real issues around supply teacher pay, and there needs to be urgent action, really, doesn't
and
it,
conditions in general, because there's the whole teacher pensions fiasco as well with it.
And umbrella companies as well, using umbrella companies to marginalise their taxes. At the same point, then getting away with shifting liabilities onto the employee. Sorry.
Right. So we've got whole groups of teachers, and I guess also we've got teachers in the independent sector who aren't covered by this. I mean, this recommendation isn't even a recommendation in the independent sector. We know there's a lot of pressure again because of COVID, lost income, etc. in the independent sector, that there's pressure on pensions, pressure over jobs, potential redundancies, and also not receiving those pay increases, sometimes even the threat of pay cuts. And then all those other members working in precarious situations, early year providers who aren't based in a school setting, that kind of thing. So we've got all those groups of people who really need to come together around a real battle over pay, fair pay across the entire sector, isn't it? But coming back to this implementation bit, I mean, this is something, if you're a teacher, employed, full-time, part-time, permanent or temporary contract in a school, this is something we can act on, isn't it, if the schools aren't planning on implementing that pay increase. And I know there are a number of reasons why schools might not. They've faced 10 years of cuts, you've got the extra costs associated with the pandemic and so on. But ultimately, we need to make sure that these cost of living increase, that it's implemented across all schools, isn't it? So how do we go about that?
Part of it depends on your school, doesn't it? So I'm lucky. This isn't going to be much work for me in my school. We have a joint consultative committee, and so every that was put into the terms of the school when we became an academy. And so all staff policies are sat down with the union representatives and the governors, and we go through and we have a vote. And it is standard policy through the JCC and union negotiating in the past that the pay offers will always be implemented in my school. So for me, that's fairly easy because we've developed mechanisms over time.
I think there's a level before that as well, though.
Yeah, go on.
Probably coincide at the same time. So from a branch officer point of view, when I'm attending JCCs for the local authority, I know that that's on the agenda for the one that we've got this month, because I received the agenda the other day. So that's our opportunity then to do the negotiating and bargaining for all of the members within our area. And then that model policy that we pull together for the local authority is then disseminated out to all of the schools within the area. And then it's up to the members in those schools to get together and collectively organise to ensure that the recommendations within the model policy are actually put into practice.
Brilliant. So I'm going to try and put this in stages. So we have this independent review body that I think I think many of its members are appointed by government, isn't it? Not fully independent, but this independent review body which comes up with a recommendation. Government can choose to accept that or not. It then accepts whatever it does, and it puts that out as a recommendation. Then you've got these processes you both just described here. So you've got at local authority level, there'll be the union, local officers will be negotiating over the pay policy and the implementation of that in the local authority pay policy. And at school level, where there's negotiating machinery, joint consultative committees, joint union committees, those kind of things. Again, you'll be meeting with the employer to make sure that that is written in and implemented. So that will cover a large number of workplaces as we go through that. But then, Merike, you mentioned at the end, even if it's in a local authority pay policy, in those schools, local authority or academy schools, where there isn't a direct negotiating body with the school management, it still needs to be implemented at that school level, doesn't it? So what do we do? What can you do if you're in that situation? Let's say you're in a school, you're not aware that there's any kind of union negotiating machinery with school management, and you don't know if they're going to implement this pay increase. What's your first step? What do we need people to be doing?
Come together and have a chat about it as a union group for a start. If you've got a school rep, that would be a good person to go and have a little chat to leadership and see if they are going to be adopting the model pay scales within the pay policy. If you don't have a school rep, that would be a good time to elect one.
So get together and find out what the school's planning on doing first of all. Yeah. And then if the school isn't planning on implementing it, that's where we've got a battle on our hands.
That is,
where we've got to collectively put that position that actually, given everything that's gone on, given everything members have been through, that actually they deserve that pay increase and they're going to get it.
It's not just leadership as well that you'd be speaking to at that point. So I'm a school governor as well, one of my many hats, and we essentially agree and sign off on the school's pay policy for the year, and there's always a section at the back that we have to tick as to whether we want to adopt the model policy pay scales or come up with our own. So we always adopt the model policy pay scales, because why would we come up with more work for ourselves? So governors would be a good person, good set of people. Goodness me, I clearly haven't had enough coffee today, sorry. Yeah, talk to governors as well, tell them, put your case forward, whether you feel comfortable doing that in person, having a chat, or whether you would prefer to write them a letter, depends on the governors, I suppose, or board of trustees if you're in a MAT.
The key bits is collective approach, isn't it? So the earlier you get together, I mean, obviously in a socially distanced way, maybe online, but the earlier that you get together as a school group, you find out what's happening about the pay increase, and then you start to organise. If they're not planning on implementing it, you start to identify, okay, what is it that we want? Clearly the implementation of this pay increase. Who's got the power to make that decision? We're talking senior leaders, a head teacher, and the governing body, ultimately the governing body. And then what pressure can you apply to ensure that implementation takes place? And I guess that's where you can get guidance again from your local union officers, local secretaries, etc. But ultimately, they'll be supporting you collectively to put the pressure on as a staff, because that's where it needs to be won at the level of each employer. And if you're an academy group or a chain or a MAT or something, that might be organising across a number of schools to win that policy. But the sooner people come together collectively to do that, the more chance they've got.
Absolutely, it's so important, the collective aspect of it. You've strengthened numbers, you know, the word union is there for a reason. Work together, and don't just rely on one person to stick their head above the parapet, so to speak, and be that person to try and win it for you. Everybody needs to come together in order for it to be a success.
Totally. And I think also keeping local officers in the loop. So if you've got the pay increase, if that cost of living increase is already in there, notifying your local officers so they can tick you off. And if you haven't, making sure they know early so they know where needs intervention. Just thinking of pay this term, because it's not just the cost of living increases there, as well as the cost of living increase, there's these spine points that we were looking at a moment ago. People working through the main scale, M1, M2, all the way up to M6. And in most areas of the country, that's a 6-point scale. But we know in some areas, academies have tried to implement a 12-point scale, an 8-point scale, a 12-point scale to make it longer.
Not just academies. I know of some local authorities that have got points A and B on them. Yeah.
I mean, basically, all these things delay you, don't they? Karam, go on.
We've got 14 in ours. 14 pay
14.
points on ours. Yep, with the
Why?
idea that they went from the 6. They went from the 6. They moved it to 7, and then they doubled it to 14. So a standard increase would be 2 points. So that if somebody didn't meet all their objectives, they could have half of an increase instead.
Yeah, and of course this is always phrased in terms of, well, better half than not meeting all your objectives and getting none. But of course, what happens in practice then is school budget's under pressure. They can't afford the full increase, so they're bound to, whether it's legal or not, they're bound to start looking, well, where could we do a half here and a half there, save a bit of money. So actually, this is something people could be tackling now as well. If you've got one of these point scales that on the main scale has more than 6 points, you're effectively disadvantaged compared with the rest of the country. So we want now people starting to, again, same process, get together, identify what you want to change and what pressure you're able to put on management to change that and to get back to the 6 point main scale that others have. But there's another element as well, isn't there? Because of course, this will be the term in most schools. I think it used to be a national framework. Now you can vary the time of year, but in most schools, this will be the term when decisions on appraisal or performance management, it's called in some schools, are taken. And that decision will determine whether people progress up the pay scale. Tell me a bit about that process for people who aren't familiar with it. How does it work? How should progression work?
So you performance-related pay, essentially, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, make sure that your performance being managed throughout the year. You get targets and appraisal targets, and then if you meet those, then you get given a pay rise, which is always nice. This year, did you notice there was like a plague happened and people went into lockdown and schools weren't operating in the usual way, meaning that your appraisal targets probably weren't going to be achievable.
So there'll be a whole number of targets, that can't have been met during the conditions of lockdown for a variety of reasons.
Yeah, especially those who were unfortunate enough to have theirs linked to numerical data and test results and such. That's another thing that you could collectively organise around, not having it linked to that, because it shouldn't be.
Yeah, it's been increasingly happening over recent years, isn't it?
Yeah.
Having test data in there rather than the general objectives that should be there. But go on, tell me the situation.
So this year, it's going to be nigh on impossible, isn't it, to actually accurately assess whether or not a teacher or support staff has met their appraisal targets.
And yet we know how hard people have worked through lockdown. We know that people have put that. I think that's why the unions come out with a position that progression this year should be automatic. Doesn't matter whether you're going up the main scale, the upper pay spine, or if you're at that point of threshold where you cross from one into the other, the bit where you're supposed to have evidence of 2 years of successful performance management reviews. That the fact is, given the outstanding lengths which people have gone to look after our most vulnerable children, the children of key workers, the wider reopening, all of that we're saying progression should be automatic this year. It's the right and fair thing to do, not to hold people back because of a pandemic that they didn't cause.
Exactly. And also there's a growing number of multi-academy trusts who have quite rightly got rid of performance-related pay from their pay policies as well.
So people progress automatically in those workplaces.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
it's something Karam, I think we should be trying to get out of school teachers' pay and conditions document, actually.
The schools that have decided to do away with performance-related pay, they're doing automatic progression as long as you're not on capability. And really, that's what the whole idea of performance-related pay is kind of nonsensical if you've got a decent capability process. Because capability should be picking up people who aren't doing their jobs correctly. And if it's a fair, even document, then you shouldn't need performance-related pay.
I remember watching a really good short video. I think it was by Dan Pink, but I'm not entirely sure. But I'll see if I can dig it out and put it maybe in the description of this chat. But it was a really good video that looked at the impact of performance-related pay. And he said there are contexts in which it works. If your aim is, I don't know, how many crates you can stack in an hour or something, and paying by the crate makes people stack the crates faster. But the more you increase the complexity of the work, the less positive impact performance-related pay has, until actually it begins to have a negative impact. Because essentially what people are doing is the complexity of the work increases, but they've got these targets. They're trying to jump through the hoops of the targets rather than trying to do the complex task that they've got. Now, I may be biased as a teacher, but what could be more complex than the education of young minds? And the moment you reduce that to hitting certain numerical targets, what's going to happen is people are going to do whatever they can to hit those targets because they want to be able to pay the mortgage. But at the same time, they're not focusing on the broader task of education, and you end up with that, that excessive focus on exams, etc., which we know runs throughout the system, not because any teacher wants it, but because we all got to pay the bills, right? So performance-related pay, it has a detrimental effect in education. All the evidence suggests this. So maybe here's an opportunity. If a number of multi-academy trusts and others are considering it, maybe some local authorities will jump on board too. Now is the year when, people have worked so hard, when we know that next step should be automatic. But maybe now's the opportunity to get rid of performance-related pay. Another area we could organise around collectively, right?
Yep. Sounds
Definitely.
good. Do it.
So go on. Any final words, any final comments? What do we need to be conscious of in terms of pay this term?
I'd like to point out that exactly why it's such a big issue as well, because it has, particularly for younger members, it's going to have a longer cumulative effect, because you're not just being hit for your wage. That's because of how the pensions are now calculated after the changes. If you're losing £4,000 of income every year, then that's going to reduce your average earnings.
Yeah, I logged into my teacher's pensions thing the other day, and I logged straight back out again because it was depressing, quite frankly.
Right, so clear message there. Think about the future. Every bit you get held back on pay now, whether it's because the cost of living isn't implemented in your school, whether it's because you're held back on progression, or indeed whether it's because of just how awful support staff pay is, all of that will then have a knock-on impact, not only in terms of your pay going forward, but in terms of your pension as well. And what are the solutions?
Talk to your members in your school, find out if an issue that you have is widely felt and deeply felt, and if the answer is yes to both of those things, organise around it.
Karam?
And I would recommend as a tactic, if you're in one of those schools where not many people are putting their head above the parapet, and in particular with the inabilities to do meetings as easily due to social distancing, I'm finding surveys are working really well in schools at the moment. You've then got quantitative data, and then you can say, I'm representing these members. They can say what they want whilst knowing that they can't be targeted.
Right, so the key is, whether it is informal chats, whether it's surveys, whether it's calling union meetings online or in a socially distanced way, the key is talk to your colleagues about pay this term, work out what's fair, work out what's not fair, and deal with the latter. Thanks both for your time today.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I'll see you later.
Bye.